So thank you everybody for joining us today. And I see that people are still coming on board for the webinar. Sincere apologies for the tech issues this morning, because technology, as you know, technology is your friend until it's not. And so everybody runs into those situations once in a while, and it just happened to us today. So there you go. My name is Deb Sydenham, and I'm the Executive Director for the Urban Land Institute here in Arizona. And on behalf of the MAG Housing Collaborative, I'm excited to welcome you today. It's the third webinar in a series that has been taking place over the course of the year. This one is entitled Strengthening Opportunities for Successful Housing Development Partnerships. And we are joined today by a great group of speakers, subject matter experts that have robust experience in their respective fields in areas that have all sorts of effects and influences on housing development in general. But today's webinar wouldn't be possible without the great partnership that went into its development and its making. And I was really excited and very fortunate to work with Allison Cook Davis. Allison is the research director for the Morrison Institute of Public Policy at ASU. And you'll see Allison come in. She's going to be holding down the anchor slot today at the end of the webinar. Interestingly enough, with the cross-section of attendees for today's webinar, we have representatives from communities all across the state of Arizona. Approximately 1/3 of the attendees today, or participants today, are coming from rural Arizona and places outside the metro area. So that's really exciting to see. Anyway, since we'll go ahead and get started, we'll jump right into this. And again, we're really excited that you could join us for this conversation today. Housing and housing development and providing housing along the entire continuum is critical, not only here in Arizona and in the region, but across the country. And trying to meet that need has been very challenging, to say the least. And so we're hopeful that you'll find some tidbits to take away today. The conversation, I have no doubt, is going to be very compelling, and we're really excited for this conversation. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to the incredible thought leader that we have moderating today's conversation. She's got 27 years of experience in the housing market here in Phoenix Metro, is very knowledgeable, not just in housing in the metro area here, but across the country as well. Please welcome Catherine Reagor, senior real estate journalist for the Arizona Republic, who's going to guide us through today's conversation and help wrangle the cats and take this forward. So turn it over to you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks for that great intro. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, such important issues. And I thought, first of all, I would give you a little overview of housing. We can go through that and go to the first slide, and I'll jump right in. Moving slide. There we go. Thank you. Okay. This won't surprise anyone, but Metro Phoenix in Arizona needs more homes. And here's why. There we go. Thank you. Population growth has boomed. We know it. We're lucky. It's a great thing. It's fueled our growth for a long time. But with that boom, particularly during the pandemic, Metro Phoenix home prices jumped, and so did apartment rents. We led the nation for apartment rents in 2021, and rents jumped in most parts of the country, except some cities where people left. But since 2020, our home prices are up 50%. And Metro Phoenix, Arizona was long considered, the really affordable place for the West, and really affordable place for other parts of the country. We drew people from Chicago and Florida, Dallas, Denver, but now we are more expensive than Dallas and Chicago and parts of Florida. So that's part of our shortage. Okay, what is slowing housing development? Higher interest rates. We know it, we see it, we hear it. Slowing building as well as buying. Zoning issues. I was just at a neighborhood meeting in Chandler the other day, going over zoning issues. High land costs, a construction workforce that's not big enough hasn't grown with the market and shrunk after the last recession, construction material shortages, and a growing NIMBYism sentiment. And again, I was at a neighborhood meeting in Chandler 2 nights ago, and it's there. So we have a great panel to address this. And let me introduce them quickly, and then we'll go hear from each one of them. Economic Development, Chris Camacho, President and CEO of the Greater Phoenix Economic Council. Land Use, Wendy Riddell, founder and partner Barry Riddell. Multifamily Development, John Garshick, Development Director, Alliance Residential. Transportation, Ed Zuercher, Executive Director, Maricopa Association of Governments. Water, Grady Gammage Jr., co-founder and partner, Gammage and Burnham. Great panel. If we'll pop to the next slide, I'll wrap this up and we get to our panel. Thanks. So we've talked to the panels and we're going to hear from them what can be done. We know if nothing's done and the housing shortage doesn't ease, we don't figure out a solution, our homeless population will grow. And there are other side effects. Nick, thanks. Growth could slow. If people can't find or afford housing in Metro Phoenix, they'll leave or opt to not move to the Valley. Housing has been, to quote Mark Stapp, our calling card in Arizona and Metro Phoenix for so long, relatively affordable housing. And if fewer businesses don't move or expand because they can't find workers, then our growth will slow. And so that tees us up for our CEO of Growth, Chris Camacho.
All right, Catherine. Well, thank you. Thanks for the audience joining us today. I have a few brief thoughts I wanted to convey and share with this group, and understanding from Deb that we have a number of statewide folks joining us. I think it's important to note that over the last 20 years, I've spent time in the urban market and spent time in the rural markets. And one thing that's consistent over time is that if you go back 20 years ago, housing was one of our advantages. We had a plethora of available stock. We had price points that were conducive for not only people to move up in their housing position, but also as people were moving to Arizona holistically, whether you're Yuma, La Paz County, Mojave County, or Maricopa, around the state, there was a plethora of opportunities. And for years, we would describe the market or even brand the market as an affordable place for a family to grow and scale, an affordable place for companies to move to and scale. And that market model is quite a bit different now. And as Catherine referenced, if you dig into the building supply side data, we're just severely underbuilding, and we have since the Great Recession. And so how does that parlay into, as it was said, a dynamic economy is one that is rooted in innovation, it's rooted in exports, it's rooted in quality infrastructure. And for years, we've tried to build an economy that was supported by housing and growth, not driven by housing and growth. But we're not acutely immune from the overexposure to growth, in that we have roughly 100 or 90 to 100,000 people moving to our state every year. And as a byproduct, those new residents consume products and services in our communities, in our regions, and throughout our state. And as most of you know, and I won't bore you with this, but as a tax code guy, I look at where our revenue comes from, and it's largely tied to people having disposable income to buy goods and services, and particularly goods. And so, as our TPT grows, as do our communities and how they pay for parks and public safety and infrastructure and so forth. So what I think is interesting too, just to shed a little bit of light on Catherine, is, and I'll be brief about this, but the key site selection factions, the way companies think about moving a distribution center, a research and development center, a headquarters, has shifted. It's still consistently about available labor being number one, about the quality of community and the infrastructure in that community. It's certainly about the business operating environment, and are we cost competitive as a state or not? But I can tell you, in the last 3 years, housing affordability and housing stock availability for those employees has now entered the conversation. And I'll give you one additional wrinkle to that. As you mentioned in one of your slides, you had NIMBYism referenced. There's also a new term in the economic development field, which is banana thinking, which is the cohort of your loudest anti-growth folks being focused on building absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, there is that thinking that historically Arizona never had to embrace. That was the other markets we'd compete with had a lot of NIMBYism or banana thinking. So, that is something we're grappling with. So let me just conclude with, because you're going to hear from Grady here talking about water and all these key ingredients to our success. But one of the things I have seen overtly change in the last few years is the major employers around the state that are looking to tap into Arizona's growing, vibrant economy and market. They are not just, let me give you the historical example. They've historically said, we know there's enough available infrastructure. We know there's enough available housing stock. All we need is really for you to ensure that we can get our permits on time. Fast forward to today, this conversation is about community capacity. Does your community have the resilient infrastructure that we need? Does it have the affordability and housing stock to meet our employee needs if we're moving employees in, or the wages that we're able to pay? Can our employees have the right kind of community livability experience that we desire as a company? So one of those prime examples is, and probably well known across the state, is Taiwan Semiconductor. They've moved up and have publicly announced several thousand jobs in North Phoenix. The conversations with the city of Phoenix for the last several years, this took 7 years to commence their commitment or get their commitment, in the last several years have been building their fabs. We're working in tandem with the city of Phoenix, with the state housing authority, on how do we ensure that companies like that are building on virgin desert land are also thinking about the requisite multifamily and single family building stock. So we're kind of growing with these companies. That was not something we talked about even 3 to 4 years ago, but is now in virtually every major employer conversation to date. So with that, I'll give you that introduction to how we're thinking about housing as a key ingredient to successful economic development. It's about a partnership, and virtually every one of the companies we're working with today, we're working with our cities across the valley to ensure we address this in the short term, but we need supply across every asset class. That's the big key Catherine referenced in her introduction. So with that, I'll pause and hand it back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Chris. Very interesting. And I had not heard that phrase about the banana. I think that is really interesting. Thank you. So that segues very well into land use, making sure that we can get us. So Wendy, you are up to talk about that, please.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I have definitely heard the phrase banana a few too many times. That's not news to me. I think the single biggest issue we find is how long and how much uncertainty there is in the development process today. When I started out as a baby attorney, we would quote everybody, no problem. It was 6 months to get through a zoning process, 6 months site plan, you'd get building permits inside of 12 months. That was great. I'm not quoting really in nearly any city less than 12 months to entitle something. And that's when you just start looking at the actual site plan and building permit process. And of course, you've got to look at what it takes across the entire spectrum. So not only are we finding the NIMBYism, the banana, making it much harder to zone and entitle properties, we're finding that I'm spending way more time dealing with site planning issues, permitting issues. I'm showing up to concrete pours for clients because they're so desperate. I mean, it's across the entire spectrum through inspections. We have to find ways as a development community to collaborate with cities to improve this process. I mean, we joke around here, while it's tremendous job security for me, I don't think I'm in any danger of losing a job anytime soon. And for us not to face what I think will be the single biggest economic crisis here in Arizona, we simply have to find ways to make housing easier to develop and more certain for developers to be able to build it. The other problem that you talked about, of course, is NIMBYism. And I wish I had an easy fix for that because I face it day in and day out. I think we have to find ways to educate the population and as well as encourage courageous local politicians, getting them to understand that there are people that vote that aren't on Facebook, getting them to understand that they have to take a broader community perspective, and then trying to get the voters to understand that it is in their best interest, it actually is in their property interest to vote for people that are going to be pro-development, that are going to be pro-housing. That is how, from my perspective, they actually keep their property values, not the reverse. I took my 13-year-old son to a neighborhood meeting this last week because I thought, he's off, he's on break, you got to see what I do here. And he was shocked. I mean, he stood there and said, Mom, don't the people who stand up and they're behind a microphone and they're yelling at you because I didn't get notice of the meeting realize that they're in the meeting? Don't the people that are yelling at you realize somebody had to do this to their house? I mean, he's 13. We've got to find a way to put that perspective and give that perspective to everybody else to help see our way through this housing crisis together.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. And it is, you hear from politicians, and there are groups like Home Matters of, that Home Arizona that have started up to try to help with some of that political will. But I think several of us were at a meeting at ASU earlier this year talking about these issues. And Elliot Pollock said, this, in his career of 55, 59 plus years, being an economist, this is the one deal breaker for our economy.
He will tell you it's the single biggest economic crisis our state is facing. 200 people a day moving to Maricopa County. I mean, think about that. That's staggering. And we want Chris to be able to bring great companies here, but they're not going to if they don't have a place for those workers to live. And if, it's a ripple effect. And I think we have to really work together to figure out how to overcome this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I just want to jump in real quick and say, if you have questions, please post them in the chat. We have time for a Q&A at the end, and we'd really like to get your questions. And next up, transportation, hand in hand with everything. Ed.
Thanks, Catherine. Good to be here with you. Thanks for joining us, everybody online. So I am Executive Director of Maricopa Association of Governments, which is a collaboration of the 32 regional member agencies, all cities, towns, 2 counties, Maricopa and Pinal, and our 3 Native Nation partners. And it is the forum for governments to get together to speak about issues. And one of the main ones is transportation. And the connection between housing and transportation is sort of intuitive. And I just want to talk a little bit about today. Over the last 40 years, the region has invested significantly in a transportation network. If you think about 40 years ago in 1985, the freeway network consisted of I-17 and a discontinuous I-10 and a little bit of the US 60 built as a freeway. 40 years later, we now have our loop system, light rail, expansive bus service, dial-a-ride, street network that is all a result of one thing, which was a vision of our elected officials in 85 and again in 2005, and the voters of Maricopa County voting twice to tax themselves to build a transportation network. The slide I want to focus on is sort of what my kids would tell me is a no duh moment, Dad, which is transportation and housing. Transportation drives housing. I could put a slide up here that we got from Chris, which would be very similar of jobs and business locates. But what this is showing is where apartments in the last 10 years or so have been permitted and their proximity to either a freeway or light rail. And it's staggering, and it sort of puts data to what is intuitive. And that is that housing options follow transportation options. And that's the connection we have here is an investment in transportation opens up investments in housing. And it also creates opportunities for that housing to effectively serve people in connection to their work, their school, where they want to play, where they want to recreate. So the investment in transportation that has been made by the voters of Maricopa County, represented by their mayors, supervisors, Native Nation leaders, is represented on this map. And that has helped us with housing. And so we need to continue our investment in transportation to continue good investment in housing that's connected to jobs and employment and the other things that I mentioned. The other thing about housing is you have to view it in a bundle with transportation costs. The old statement of drive till you qualify worked and continues to work somewhat, although there's been disruptions in how people work, gas prices, all those things start adding in costs. So you drive till you qualify, and then you discover that the cost of getting to where you want to work or play are a lot, and that has to be added into your housing costs. So, you know, when the federal highway or the federal Department of Transportation likes to talk about the bundle of housing costs with transportation costs, and in many cases that can exceed 50% of someone's income. So making a way for the transportation costs to be lower, either through good transit access or fully functioning freeways and arterials, has been a focus of the Maricopa Association of Government. You know, so I think on this slide, what's interesting to me is all the dots that are clustering around the freeways, but also looking at the dots that are clustering around the light rail system. And you can see that impact on the lower center portion of the slide, where there's a cluster of apartments permitted around something that hasn't been built yet or is in the process of being built, which is the South Central Light Rail line. And that shows the power of that investment in light rail on South Central to bringing some investment in housing. And of course, you look at Central Phoenix and Tempe and all along the line into Mesa, you see those clusters around the light rail line and certainly around the freeways. So continuing to make strategic transportation investments is an important part of housing affordability. What is now being called Prop 479, which is the extension of the current Prop 400. Prop 400, the half-cent sales tax for transportation, expires at the end of 2025. We got it passed through the legislature, signed by Governor Hobbs, and the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors last week approved putting a now numbered Prop 479 onto the ballot for November 5th, 2024. That investment will build new transportation, which will open up new areas for housing, like the State Route 24 in the east, the State Route 30 in the southwest. It also continues to invest in developed transportation corridors like light rail, buses, like the Loop 303 at Grand Avenue, I-17, 101, 202. All those investments continue to make it more viable to live and invest in the developed parts of town, as in addition to the parts of town that are developing. So the bottom line is investment in transportation options opens up investment in housing options. It's intuitive and empirical, as the slide shows. And so we're excited to be with you today, Catherine, and with this great panel, and we look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Ed. And I look at that map, and I saw it before, the chart, and I don't say duh. It really brings it home what transportation does, and we'll see what happens in the election next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
So looking at the map of multifamily, so John, you talk to us about that market and what's going on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for having me today. It's great to be here with all these excellent panels. Catherine gave a brief introduction earlier, but I'm John Garshick. I'm a development director at Alliance Residential. For those of you not familiar, Alliance is a national multifamily company. We have 19 regional offices, and we're headquartered here in Phoenix. And I work as part of the Southwest Division Development Team, focused on market rate development in Phoenix, Tucson, and Albuquerque. Historically, about 95% of our development is here in Phoenix. And since 2013, we built close to 7,000 units in Metro Phoenix and currently have about 2,000 units under construction across the metro area. So you want to go to the slide, Catherine?
I can't, can someone pop the next?
Oh.
There.
So in preparing for our conversation today, I was trying to, go into the question of what causes Alliance to select a site. And you sort of came up with this, decision tree that helps, kind of display our decision-making process at a high level and sort of walk through the process of how we think about, our investment decisions. And, far and away, the most important thing we look at is and when deciding on a site, is the area incomes, and do those incomes support the rents that we both want to and need to charge to make for a financially feasible investment. And one reason that we've been able to successfully develop so many projects over the past few years that, Chris and his team and his partners have done such a great job in bringing, high quality jobs with sufficient incomes to the Metro Phoenix area. So you see that stop sign down below. If we decide, early on the answer is no, we kind of have to pick up and move on to, what's our next, what's another site, what site makes more sense from a financial feasibility perspective. So as you move down that decision tree, if our answer is yes, most of our sites kind of have one of two or both, I guess, locational attributes. Is it, proximate to retail and entertainment amenities? I.e., is it close to where our potential residents want to eat, play, shop, etc.? Or is it, close to employment center? Is it, adjacent to or near, a large employment area where, potential residents either currently work or residents are relocating from out of state, out of Metro Phoenix to come, and potentially live in our community and work nearby. And so just to, present a few examples that we of, recent developments, we several years ago built a project called Broadstone Stetson in Old Town Scottsdale, very close to the entertainment district, not necessarily, close to, lots of employment, but the residents who want to live there, the bars and amenities in Old Town Scottsdale were the reason that was driving their living decision. Similarly, we built successful communities in downtown Phoenix near Roosevelt Row and are currently under construction with a community in Glendale, walking distance from the West End Entertainment Center. In terms of employment centers, we have two communities under construction in the West Valley, one in Goodyear, another one in Glendale, is trying to located near the Loop 303 industrial corridor. And we've also had a lot of success locating communities near hospitals and playing into the workforce there, as a lot of those residents value being close to the hospital and being able to come home to a safe community as they may have off hours. The final rungs of kind of our decision-making process, or Ed did a great job touching on the importance of transportation. We've had a lot of success locating communities near the light rail, as that map showed. And for a lot of our residents, the light rail is not necessarily their main mode of transport, but it's an amenity, and they like having that option nearby and having it available to, as well as the amenities that often locate near the light rail. And another consideration that Wendy touched on is the municipal environment. We've certainly dealt with our fair share of NIMBYism, in multiple zoning cases and approval processes. And as Wendy touched on, it's important to educate those people who are expressing concerns about new development and work with them to overcome those hurdles as we work through the approval process. I'll touch on, I guess in closing, I'll touch on briefly kind of the other considerations. It's I guess the most important one being the capital markets component. Catherine touched on it earlier in terms of interest rates and how that's impacting new development. Obviously there was a boom in 2021 and 2022 in Metro Phoenix with tons of new apartments breaking ground. But at the same time, we could have built more given the availability of capital at that time. We had sites that with capital willing to finance it, but we ran into barriers in the initial approval process that slowed us down. So I think touching on capital markets, I'd say because financing, the availability of financing can come and go. But when that financing is available, in order to increase the overall housing stock, it's important for us all to work together with communities to speed up the development process and allow us to get more shovels in the ground and begin construction. So with that, Catherine, I'll bring it back to you.
Thank you, John. Really informative. Appreciate that. And now the other big component of our housing, what's going on? Grady, let's talk about water.
Yeah, so you're coming to me last, and for a very long time, that was kind of how we regarded the water issue. It was like an afterthought. It was not a big deal. We'd done a great job. Arizona was famous for good water management. We had plenty. We would keep growing. Suddenly, that's not true anymore. And it's not true anymore because of three reasons. One is we all watch the water levels in Lake Mead and Lake Powell in a way we never used to. And that is such a graphic and visible metric for how water is doing. And the Colorado River hasn't been doing great. The second reason is the Groundwater Management Act has suddenly been rejuvenated by the Arizona Department of Water Resources, which has determined that there's not enough groundwater for all the growth that we thought was going to occur on groundwater in the greater Phoenix area. And the third reason is the taps went dry in Rio Verde. Now, the taps going dry in Rio Verde is a fairly isolated and quirky problem of jurisdictional dispute between Scottsdale and an unincorporated area in the county, but it was seized upon by national media as evidence of how serious the other two problems were. And it really doesn't have anything to do with the other two problems, other than it does have to do with the way subdivision is regulated under the Groundwater Management Act. So out of those three things, we sort of have two issues. One is a perception issue, and the perception issue is very serious. Chris deals with this all the time. I deal with it all the time. We get constant calls because of what people have read that there's no water left in Phoenix and growth had to be shut off. That is not true, but it is a perception issue that we have not yet overcome. The reality issue is that there is now a serious constraint on housing development. It is a constraint in the edge areas of the county and those cities which do not have designated water supply. And that mainly means Buckeye and Queen Creek, two of the fastest growing cities in the United States. I will just say, I understand why the Department of Water Resources had to do that. I understand the constraints they are operate under the Groundwater Management Act, but the reality is they found a 4% shortfall over the next 100 years. Any government program should be so lucky as to only have a 4% shortfall over 100 years. But nevertheless, it has had a dramatic impact. Now, in the reality side of the column, you will hear that there are something like 90,000 lots that have already been approved as having a water supply and can go ahead and develop. I've heard significant dispute over whether that's the right number or whether it's in fact substantially less. But the thing that we have to think about in terms of the impact on housing is that housing has a long pipeline to reach development, particularly this kind of housing on the edge. It is often 5, 6, 7 or years or more from when somebody like Wendy or me is hired to get zoning approval on the project, go it through all of the necessary approvals and get it out there and developed. The big production home builders talk about this pipeline of entitlement to get to actual houses. So let's suppose that there are 75 or 80,000 units that can go ahead and develop even after the declaration of no more groundwater use in areas without a designation. That's going to run out here in 5 or 6 or 7 years. That means it's going to run out at about the time we are now needing to start to entitle and develop those things. For the time being, housing is still going to be available, but that's going to create a very serious compression and an additional upward pressure on housing prices. So this is a major issue that is going to have to be dealt with. It is getting dealt with slowly. The Governor's Commission is going to come out with some recommendations. One of them is what is called an ADAWS, alternative designation of assured water supply, which will be a way for places like Queen Creek and Buckeye, at least theoretically, to get to being designated providers more quickly and more simply than they would otherwise have been able to do. Very much still in the embryonic stages, not sure how well it's going to work or what's going to happen. But all of this is going to have an impact, not only just on the price of houses, but on how we develop, the densities at which we develop, the nature of landscaping in various areas, and not just on housing, but on offices and industrial and the kinds of things where we have made great progress in diversifying our economy away from sunshine and cheap houses, which was our formula for so many years, as Chris talked about, toward a more diversified base. But all of those things are going to come under pressure as we try to figure out how to grapple with the increasing restriction on the use of groundwater for development and the increasing lesser availability of Colorado River water.
Water. So thank you, Grady. And I mean, I think when we talked on the pre that things are changing quickly with all of this. Is that correct?
Yeah, they are. I mean, there are proposals floating around in the governor's commission. There are other proposals that are being slowly dribbled out that will perhaps go straight to the legislature. I'm not sure how all that's going to come together. One proposal that we should talk about with its impact on housing is there's been this move toward build-to-rent single-family homes. Build-to-rent single-family homes have not had to comply with the assured water supply rules because this is a big picture problem people should know about. The assured water supply rules, the Groundwater Management Act itself, is a consumer protection measure. It's not a water management measure. It was passed, it was drafted, and the structure of it is all about disclosing to home buyers whether there's a risk or not. Well, the notion was if somebody's renting, they didn't need that disclosure. So it is totally logical that it didn't apply to rental units. But that, particularly as single family built to rent, has become more popular, primarily over price reasons. But it's been a way to develop without an assured water supply. That's now viewed as a loophole. Well, it isn't really a loophole. It was the whole structure of the thing was not designed to deal with that. But because it's viewed as a loophole, that's the first thing that is likely to get changed under the water supply rules. Interesting. I wonder what was going on with that. So I want to ask all the panelists a question, and why don't we just go reverse? I'm sorry to put you on the that we started on the talking seat again, Grady, but we'll start with you and then go backwards and end with Chris. What needs to be done now for this not to become a full crisis, for our growth to just really slow, that we don't attract companies like the Taiwanese semiconductor? Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, cities like Phoenix, where TSMC is, Mesa, Tempe, Scottsdale, and so on, have a pretty diverse water portfolio and are all designated providers. But having said that, we are going to need to shore up the availability of CAP water for those cities. Queen Creek is one city that has sought to do that by acquiring main stem Colorado River water rights. It's not a lot of water, it's 2,000 acre feet, and using the CAP canals to wheel that to central Arizona. We have for a very long time, in contrast to some other Western states, urban development and agriculture have had kind of a natural marriage because we were urbanizing where we were farming. That's the history of Maricopa County and up till recently, the history of Pinal County. But we are now going into an era where there's going to be conflict between main stem river farming along the Colorado and wanting to move some of that water here. We're also going to be needing to figure out how to move groundwater from remote basins in Western Arizona that will never develop likely through the CAP canal. Now that raises a different set of issues, but again, ones that can be dealt with. It's different because the water is different. And so you're commingling surface water and groundwater, and they have different chemistry and turbidity and impact on things. The big picture of what needs to happen is 70% of the water in Arizona is still used for agriculture. And the way water law works, based on a couple hundred years, 150 years of evolution, is that because the water was originally developed for agriculture, agriculture has a preference. So right now we are faced with the anomalous situation. Pinal County is the most graphic example. We can't build houses anymore because they need a 100-year assured water supply. But we can go on farming, which doesn't need a 100-year water supply. And that farming takes 3 to 4 times as much water as the houses would. So we have a much lower economic value proposition from the farming that will continue at the expense of housing, which would bring much more economic benefit to the state. I don't want to come off as an anti-agriculture person, but we have to look at reality. And that's going to have to transition over time. And it's going to cost. It's going to cost to compensate farmers to let that water move. It's going to take some adjustments in the way incentives to develop agricultural land work. But all of those costs are likely going to be borne ultimately by development. And that's going to push up the price of housing.
Yeah, and we're already up. Thank you. So on that note, John, for multifamily, which we need, and we need those homes, and we bring up the affordability issue and what interest rates and everything's going on. What do you think for apartment development to continue and meet demand and still get some, affordable rents in there?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the, the kind of most consistent challenge we continue to face, and when he touched on it earlier, I'm sure will again, is I guess the lengthening and inconsistent approval timelines. And then once we're under construction, inconsistencies with guidance in the field, depending on who happens to be on site that day, giving specific feedback to our construction teams. So, I mean, Wendy touched on those timelines, but, we used to, 10 years ago, we used to consider about 120 days for a zoning case. Now, between zoning and any subsequent approvals, we're anticipating at least 12 to 16 months, at a minimum. And that's if everything goes perfectly. And that time, that additional time adds, additional risk, additional costs, and just kind of one example, last year, I guess we submitted a project in one municipality for rezoning, and just from the submittal date for our initial pre-application to our first hearing was a 4-month gap. So before we even received any initial feedback on just that basic level of design, and then before we could proceed to city council, we're required to complete a full set of civil drawings as part of that, even though the project was nowhere near construction or building permit ready, only to eventually be denied at city council. So it added substantial cost and risk to the entire process for a project that was not near any, and I guess not near any sort of groundbreaking. So, and then to touch on, I guess, the field component, there's several examples of the past few years where we receive a permanent set of plans we're under construction and in the field, and we'll receive additional guidance at that point that requires additional submittals, another full review from that particular municipality, and I guess just to resume construction for what was, as I mentioned, was an already approved design set. So all that adds time and adds cost, and just it prevents more housing from getting in the marketplace, which creates the affordability that we're all looking for.
Yeah, thank you. I talked to many developers, and I'm hearing that, and of course it's all different from different municipalities. The process and what's going on, and municipalities are working on that. Thank you. And so, Ed, I know an obvious answer is that we need to pass them on next year, but you and Meg, know so much more about growth. What do you see from the big picture that we could do now?
Well, thanks, Catherine. I think in terms of transportation, we need to continue the investment in transportation and in transportation options for people at a variety of places in life. I have parents who are aging, fortunately aging in place, but getting to a point where they may not be able to drive themselves anymore. What sort of options do they have to continue to live where they want to live without a car? And there are other people who, need to have good freeway access and that sort of thing. We need buses, light rail, dial-up. We need it all. We need the variety in transportation. We need to keep investing in that. As you mentioned, 479 will give people an opportunity to continue the wise investments in transportation. I think that same discussion applies in housing, as we need more supply generally, and we need to make sure that supply is diverse, because as we have at MAG a campaign about home is where it all starts, everyone should have a home that's affordable to them. And that's what has made us strong as a region, as Chris and others have talked about over in the past. The diversity of housing and diverse price points has allowed a diverse range of people to move here, start, begin, grow, And so we have to continue the efforts to do that. And that starts with talking to each other. As Wendy said, we have to be able to communicate to each other and talk through these issues that we have at the local government level, because we have a diversity of communities as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I would just say on a personal front, I have lost very talented colleagues who have moved to places where housing is more affordable, and they want to appreciate the transportation, but they want to be close and they have to travel. So to stop that trend, thanks. And Wendy, I'm actually going to ask a specific question in one of our Q&As for you. It's the developers facing challenges in implementing innovative housing projects as they encounter obstacles with local municipalities and their complex approval procedures. And John talked about this too. How can we collaborate with these municipalities to simply simplify and expedite the approval process for new housing developments?
So I think there's a whole host of ways that we can be doing that. And there's people in the background that are working on that. It's somebody mentioned, I think it's SB 1103, which now says plats, for example, don't have to be approved by city council. I mean, that's brilliant. I tell you, half the cities I talk to don't even know that's the case. And the reality is that's really codifying what's in state law anyway. City councils don't have discretion over plats. They're frankly obligated to approve them if they meet all the codes and ordinances. Why are we putting them on city council agendas? Why are we taking that extra step, taking that extra time, and why are we requiring the developer to do that? I can see in the Q&A, there's a lot of questions of how do we get affordable housing? I mean, this is all great, but how do we make that affordable? Well, the reality is all the same steps, all the same challenges are there for affordable housing, only they get to collect less rent in the end of all of this. So it's even more challenging for affordable housing. Well, why don't we have teams? And this is an idea we pitched in the city of Phoenix. Why isn't there a team that just does affordable housing? Why don't you have people that become experts in that field, that those folks know exactly who to call? Why don't we prioritize that through the site plan approval process? And oh, by the way, while we're at it, why is the site plan approval process not something I can run concurrently in the city of Phoenix as the zoning process? Every city has its own unique challenges. And I think we can sit down with those individual communities and look for ways to create reform. And let me also be clear, the developers are not blameless in this. As someone who represents them, they are definitely not blameless. I mean, we see submittals and we always try to catch it before it goes in, but they're not perfect, that they make mistakes. And, I had one client who's arguing with me, this is great and they should just be approved it. And I'm looking at it going, dude, they misspelled rezoning. Like, I'm not going to go yell at the city that this needs to get approved right away. Like, we have to take responsibility for what we're submitting to try to make clean, good submittals that are approvable. But overall, we need people to take a step back, take a high altitude perspective, to collaborate with the individual communities and say, how can we do this better? Are all these steps really necessary? And how can we incentivize people to do this well? And I think all of those things from my perspective are very achievable.
Right.
Did I answer your question? I kind of got going there.
No, thank you. We'll come back because we have some other questions. This is great. And Chris, I spoke to you a few months ago and we were talking about the housing market, the housing shortage, prices, and how that impacts job growth and your important work with that. But you mentioned it's a good point. We're not the only one with a housing problem. Metro Phoenix isn't. How do you feel like we compare to cities we compete with?
It's interesting, Catherine, on that question, in that when companies, albeit like tech firms out of the Bay Area or New York, or big manufacturers that are global in nature, searching for their new home, generally on those projects, we're competing with the other kind of IT markets in the United States. IT markets being Austin, Texas, Denver, Dallas, Atlanta, Charlotte, some of the places that also have had double-digit appreciation in both homeowner sale value, but also in rental rates. And so it's almost like a bifurcated U.S. market today. If you go to the Plains states that have had very modest percentage change, very, very different kind of migration patterns, certainly they've seen modest growth and appreciation, but it's nothing like what the quote unquote IT markets are saying. And so I think it's important to level set knowing where we are, but the reality is when you look at the data over 10 years, we went from on the composite index side of housing being a piece of the CPI, naturally being in that kind of 90-second rate against the 100 being the national average in housing, and now we're at 113. So we've climbed well above that, but as has every other market as referenced. So again, I'm careful because it sounds like, I don't care. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is every other demand side markets is seeing this kind of rate of change. But I also wanted to go back to what Wendy said, because I think it's important to reinforce this point that I constantly hear a set of stones thrown, albeit at cities in their process, or developers, are misaligned in expectations or don't care about what they're submitting, and or maybe even a third layer of this, which I think all are a bit off in a way. But there's, even when, as John referenced, going to a public hearing, the amount of the vocal minority that speak up against projects, those take the oxygen out of the room. Those are the Facebook warriors, and they're getting to councils. And so to me, when I talk to leaders at Home AZ, for example, and other parties, there needs to be the other side of the argument, but it can't be a self-interested development community. It has to be an organized set of messengers to help balance this debate, because unfortunately developers are seen as the enemy oftentimes in these conversations, and they're not. They're trying to, their job is to provide a product to make money at the end of the day. And yet, unfortunately, with a lot of the tribal debate that's happening at the national level, it's now, believe it or not, infused state government, which we knew. Now it's infusing local governments. And I think this whole debate on housing is just a symptom of that broader microcosm. So, to me, I think that's something that we need to come together as a community on, or as Grady referenced, we're going to be in a lot harder spot in even 5 years from now than we are today. And I don't know, we're going to keep growing the right types of companies, but maybe I'll leave you with this: is our conversation with our board, and I just had a mayor's call this morning, mayor's and supervisors call. We have to really, I don't want to say begin thinking, because we have been thinking about it, but thinking about the strategy of the future economy anchored towards sustainable growth, not just growth for growth's sake. Thinking about land use in a way where cities are taking into account this new job producer, what kind of quality jobs are they creating? What kind of water use are they deploying or needing as a percentage of the city's total allocation? Because I think everything's local. And I think the energy grid comes into this too, where we're talking about a resilient energy grid when you're seeing pretty immense demands for data centers or digital security usage, coupled with advanced manufacturing, coupled with even energy demands with new hydrogen hubs and other forms. So there's stress on all levels today that were not there 10 years ago. But that's when I think about a region sustainable growth model. It can't just be, again, how many permits we pulled or how much macro level GDP growth or personal income growth we've had. It's got to be about prioritization of the things we care about in the near term. So that's what we're going to be working on going forward.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. And we kind of touched on this, but come back to this. So I mentioned it before, but I was at a neighborhood meeting. It was the second one, and it is an affordable housing. And I know Mag has worked on this. Affordable housing has gotten this really negative label, which is unfortunate. So it's housing people can afford, housing the workers, the nurses, the police officers, the teachers can live in that community and afford. And that's something that's been so important to us, and it's been great for our growth because we've been able to do it. And this developer bought the land, and they have probably put 1.5 million into it, and they cut the project in half, and they're still getting pushed back. And I watched that, and you all know him, stand up on that stage and just take the heat. And I thought, when do you not give up? I mean, how do we keep fighting the good fight on this?
Well, the hardest projects to entitle, Catherine, are affordable housing projects. If you need zoning entitlements, they are the single hardest cases we have. And so as many folks are saying here, we want all of this, the reality is there's not a lot of incentive to do them.
It's tough. And, we know our homeless population is growing. It's heartbreaking. That's not also, even from the economic standpoint, to move to an area to do that. Does anybody want to jump in on that?
I will. I mean, I think there's a couple things. There's housing we can kind of get people's heads wrapped around housing for teachers and firefighters and policemen. But we also need housing for people who are serving food in restaurants, and those jobs that don't even pay as much as teachers and policemen make. Those folks deserve affordable housing they can afford as well. So we're just trying to change, as you said, Catherine, trying to change the dialogue to not being us and them, but we all need that we need a place where we can afford and live. Part of that is just generally we need more supply generally.
Yes.
You know, there's a theory of if you shrink supply, then you're just going to continue to drive people out the bottom end of the affordability scale. But part of it is also educating people that those in affordable housing are us. They are our neighbors. They are our children. They are people starting out. It's all sorts of folks who need that sort of housing. We had that experience in the last couple of weeks with a member city that's trying to do a low-income housing tax credit project that actually, when you look at the data, the income qualification is going to be at or above the median income for that community. In other words, the people who are going to use that housing are going to come in with incomes higher than the average of that community already. And there's a little bit of the Facebook warrior pushback going on, but that city council is being very brave, and they're going to move forward with it. And I think to Wendy's point, the last thing I'll say is we need people. I sat through a lot of city council meetings. If you're a city council member and you show up for a meeting and the room is filled with people who are yelling at you to say no, and there's no one there saying to say yes, what is our natural human instinct? So as Wendy said, we need to, one, reward brave councils and mayors, and two, we need to be a voice on the other side of that dialogue to bring data, information, and positivity to that. Otherwise, people do what is normal, which is they respond to who is in their face about it.
I will also add that the legislative move of eliminating the rental tax has made it harder to convince cities to entitle for multifamily. And that has been I'd seen a very immediate consequence of the legislature doing that.
And thank you for bringing that up, Wendy, because that was really, really damaging to cities. And I think it's going to make it more difficult to get multifamily density built, because one incentive for cities to entitle that was that it was going to be a revenue stream to pay for parks, police, libraries, streets. That incentive was now taken away by the legislature, which I think is damaging. I don't think that's going to be I think it's going to be a negative to housing affordability, not a positive the way it was pitched.
No question.
Catherine, I want to add one thing on this affordability issue that goes back to the water problem. I have heard a number of people express a sense of positive relief that we've stopped development on the edge, because Phoenix is too sprawling and too spread out as it is, and we need to turn back and develop more infill, and shutting down development on the edge by constraining groundwater use will be a good thing overall. We are getting more dense. We get more dense all the time, but it's not easy. And it comes in little tiny bites, a few houses here, a few units there, an apartment complex in a different place. Every one of those is a fight. And the absence of that development on the edge, which generally to begin with is entry-level housing, is going to make all of that infill housing even more expensive. The constraint on the amount of available land will make it more expensive. So I really caution people to not seize on this notion that stopping development on the edge is going to be an overall good thing. It has positive benefits. Density has positive benefits. Higher densities use less water per capita and make this a more urban place, and higher densities are beneficial to light rail transportation. There are all sorts of benefits, but it's not purely a benefit to stop it on the edge, because it loses the kind of safety valve that those entry-level houses have always been one of Phoenix's great strengths.
Catherine, just I guess one more point on the affordability, and I guess not necessarily housing classified as affordable, but more affordable housing. I think in the way to, I guess, both create more supply and have less expensive, cost of building is really, is with construction costs and the labor pool in Metro Phoenix. And you touched on it in your initial comments. Much of the labor force that was, building homes and apartments in 2005, 2006, 2007, left with the Great Recession and has not returned. And as, apartment demand, as housing demand increased in Metro Phoenix over the past several years, the labor pool did not increase with that market demand for more housing, which, resulted in increased costs. Just as an example, from 2018 to 2022, we saw costs increase, anywhere between 60 to 75%. There was some function of material costs and supply chain challenges of that, but a lot of it was related to labor and just the inability to get enough labor and skilled labor on site to complete projects on time and on budget. And that lack of labor also creates an artificial cap on supply, because no matter how many units are permitted, if there's not labor to complete those units, the number of units that can deliver in any given year is capped at, it's somewhere between 15 and 17,000 units.
It's the issues behind our housing shortage. And here's one, and this kind of, everybody kind of talked about this a little bit, but it's the legislation and moves to try to improve the process, change the zoning, and spur other housing. So last legislative session, the big bill for that was SB 1117, did not pass, and it was changed many times to try to get that through. It was bipartisan, didn't pass. People have definite feelings we shouldn't zone by the legislature, or others say something's going to happen, and there's bound to be something coming back this next session. What do you all think?
I think preemption's a terrible idea. I think you have to give cities that control ultimately. But I think the hope behind it was, I wasn't involved behind it, but I think the hope was cities would find it motivational and would say, if we don't start to engage on this issue, if we don't start to find ways to make it better, that's certainly something that the legislature could ultimately do. But I think it would be a loss to our state in general to have preemption and have it all determined at a legislative level. I think cities need to retain that ability myself.
I generally agree with that. I think overall preemption was a bad idea, and I actually thought the way the bill was written, I wasn't sure it was going to work all that well anyway. But I think there are some things that cities could do. An example, we have a lot of retail centers that are not performing, and transitioning a lot of those into higher density housing is a trend that's underway. But much of the time, every single one of those has to go through a rezoning process, and the people who live near it don't want apartments near them. They'd rather have an empty, decrepit shopping center than a new multifamily complex. You could, as a city, I think at the city level, better than the legislature, say that any C2 parcel can automatically have 40 units to the acre. We used to kind of do it that way. Back in the old days, we had what was called Euclidean zoning that would allow you to do that. That has largely been taken away over the last 20 or 30 years, to where every single project has to go through a zoning case. That's counterproductive to sort of allowing the natural transition of land uses.
And Grady, I think just to tie into that, certainly we could agree that would be appropriate along light rail, where you have these transit corridors. I mean, there's some places that ought to be quite easy to make that decision to do so, that are still huge struggles. I mean, we did a case on Central on light rail. It took 2 years, and it's density on light rail. That shouldn't be controversial. It was nuts.
And Wendy, I had a call this morning with the region's mayors, and this topic was brought up, and Chandler, Mayor Harkey, has been working with his staff on a model that's now exposed to all the other mayors on exactly what you're talking about. It's these blighted or soon to be blighted retail strip centers that have low vacancy, very little TPT, so very little ultimately tax generation in these sites. And as they become blighted, they not only do they become eyesores and public safety concerns for communities, but for developers, because I've talked on the development side, and I think there was a question about partnerships. Chandler, in this case, identified some of these particular sites and said, okay, what would it take for a company like John's to come in, blade the site, demo, assess the infrastructure, and build at some kind of multifamily scale, trying to understand the math behind that. And with the demo cost, and then as Wendy rightfully referenced, the concern over the inability to rezone or going through the public hearing process, that leaves so much risk for the private capital side of the developer. They're like, we just pick a greenfield site further out.
Well,
so
developers are super simple people. They just want predictability and certainty. No
Exactly.
offense, John, right? But it's very
No,
simple.
that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, so that's
I won't push back.
Yeah, so that's what this is. One area though that, again, I think Grady touched on this, really important, is the state has been, I would argue, punitive to the cities in ways that they would hate the feds to be punitive to them. And yet, I look at the inability to induce new tools where cities have the ability to control their own destiny around their own jurisdictions, makes it really tough. They don't have a whole lot of tools, and it's under this ideology of free markets and general kind of libertarianism. But yet, I'm saying from a state legislative standpoint, and yet I know that cities and developers could come much more together on these items if the tools were there to hold the developers harmless on this time frame process. And that seems to be the big bottleneck to do, Grady, what you just described. So I'm hopeful that it'll, at a minimum, lead to further dialogue in the legislature this year, realizing that the carrot we can dangle is more units being brought to market. That's what people want or market needs. So it's going to be a complex one, but I'm glad we're at least tackling it and talking about it.
Yeah, and that leads right into this next question. And when you all have cited different partnerships between either different ways, cities, private groups, nonprofits, to get projects done, to get housing, to move the dial forward. Can you all address some of those good partnerships, some of those examples, a city maybe, or a nonprofit stepping up? We know there are private groups like, Home Arizona, working to try to do this with different groups as well. Okay.
So I can't tell you in detail about this, but the Arizona Planning Association conference, my partner Lindsay Shuby and the city of Flagstaff and developer and Habitat for Humanity did a presentation about a project in Flagstaff that is really impressive. But I was just an audience member. I just heard about it. So I can't really tell you the whole thing, but it was
Grady, we could probably talk on Corey's, the mayor of Tempe's Hometown for All. We could argue about the legality of it, I suppose, but it has been a very successful way to get developers to contribute. It's effectively market rate multifamily. You come in and contribute 20% equivalent to your building permit fees. It's a voluntary contribution, but most people are willing to voluntarily do that because it's looked upon very favorably by the city council. And as a result, it's been a way that they have built up their trust fund for affordable and workforce housing. And I think it's a little too soon to tell how well that plays out. Part of me wonders if cities are really the best people to be doing that. But I think they're also being thoughtful about partnering with other good organizations that can go out and use that money wisely. So I think there are some examples. I can also talk about where Maricopa County, this was a while back, it's a little scary that I have to dig this deep, but where Maricopa County, when Deb Stark was the director, she put together all the developers and her staff in a room and kind of said, work it out. Tell me what we do well. Tell us what you need. And there was tremendous reform that came out of that was really effective. Mind you, it was in the county, so it's not the mecca of urban development, but it was a very useful tool in getting both sides talking to each other, and I think ultimately improving the outcome.
Great. And I know
Catherine, I'll give you a couple that I know of. One you mentioned, there's a group, this is an information gap closing, which is, I think it's called Home Inc., where they're trying to find landlords who are willing to take good renters who have certificates. And so it's like a matchmaking service that's greatly expanded the number of landlords who are willing to take renters with Section 8 certificates or affordable certificates. But it's also it's giving better information about what's required on both sides. So that's a good example. Another one is cul-de-sac in Tempe, where some developers are being creative about leveraging light rail for their development, so that there's less spent on car infrastructure, more available for the renters for amenities at a lower cost. And then the third one is a group that's finding ways to leverage existing. There's one in Tempe, one in Central Phoenix. It's Halualoa companies in a group with Steve Betts, where they're adding multifamily to sort of garden office, where there are amenities built in for the garden office. The garden office has less demand. They can use the parking that is empty at night for the residents, and they're putting together, I forget the name of the brand, but I think there's some really creative things in the development community that are happening for information sharing, but also for leveraging, different properties that have opportunities for some more density or shared use.
And I guess I can touch on, some of the more, kind of informal partnerships we often have as we, go through, our approval processes. And I think, there's some focus on NIMBYism before, but we often find that as we sit down with key neighborhood stakeholders and various neighborhood associations, they often are willing to work with us and be good partners and work towards a solution that's acceptable and equitable to everybody. And I think listening to these concerns and trying to incorporate them into the initial design of a project as you begin the approval process is important. I think especially in the city of Phoenix, we've had a lot of success working with I guess a particular project in Uptown Phoenix, working with that neighborhood association on that initial project design and incorporating their ideas when feasible was I guess enabled everybody to have an acceptable outcome.
Great. And I know I mentioned a controversial project that's not going forward, but I have also been seeing examples of developers very much working with the neighborhood groups, and both groups come away happy. It adds to the timing and the cost, but you get those supportive neighbors. And there are even, we know groups that work with developers and go door to door and talk to the neighbors. And so it's working. Okay, these are great to focus on these. And so I don't want to end on a bad note, but the big question I wonder about, and not personally, but with your job, with your career, and what's going on with housing right now and our growth, what keeps you up at night? Grady.
I will tell you, I am more worried about temperature than I am about water at the moment. Now, we just came off a brutal summer, but I don't think it's going to get better. I think the temperature problems we face are very serious, and I can see solutions to the water problems. There is water. It just needs to move around, and the rights to it need to be readjusted. The increasing temperatures in the summer are a much more intractable problem. And a lot of it is stuff we can't do anything about. It is climate change and global warming, but some of it is stuff we can do about. And this would be a good topic for another day, but there's been some discussion about parking lots. We need to think about the way in which we can use landscape in a water conservation mode to cool things. And we need to think about how we can get rid of a whole lot of the excess parking we have. It is enormous amount of parking. And, I was in charge of the Phoenix Design Review Standards process when it was first created. I was the chair of the committee, and we came up with requiring trees in parking lots. Well, that has been an abject failure. We build these little tiny tree coffins and plant trees in them that die, that never get replaced. And if they do, the second tree dies. We have got to face up to the dilemma that creates in a place that is as hot as this. And that's one I don't think we are fully dealing with now with regard to housing and commercial and all kinds of things.
Great, thank you. And I just want to throw this in real quick. The program that is with Home Inc. to help big tenants with vouchers is called the Threshold Program. So if anyone's interested in that or get involved, and also Vitalist created a list of very successful affordable housing that's affordable projects across the state and partnerships, and detail that partnerships, and it's really great. And I'll try to follow the link and put that in the chat. So anyone else, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. I mean, I touched on it earlier, but it's the, our construction costs and the lack of sufficient labor pool to deliver projects. The supply chain challenges of 2021, 2022 have mostly eased, with occasional hiccups in various trades or various items, but construction costs have not declined, and that's largely a result of just we don't have the labor force available to deliver projects. And as I mentioned, that those costs, if those costs were reduced, that's where you'd see a more affordable, I guess, housing that's more affordable for the residents of Metro Phoenix and Arizona.
Great. I will we'll start wrapping up, but I will share with you what keeps me up at night about this. I live in Midtown Phoenix, and I work in my office in downtown Phoenix. And whenever I'm driving, I see more recently homeless people. They still have their suitcases. They still have, they're still clothed. They're still walking. And I see that number rising. And I know City of Phoenix is doing a lot for it, but it's just heartbreaking. And you see it more and more, and how do we help those people? So that keeps me up at night. So I know if we get more housing, and that's what we're talking about, and it's the great takeaway, and you all are working to do so much in this group, listening, and the transportation, the water segment, the zoning, all our economic development, our jobs, all key to this economy and our future growth. And I appreciate you all for being the shepherds and watching and informing us and pushing the needle forward. So I will turn it over to Allison. Allison, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Having my own technical difficulties, I suppose. If you wouldn't mind, you can pull up the last couple of slides from the PowerPoint presentation. But just in closing, today we have been talking a lot about what we can do to work with diverse partners and create and preserve housing, some of the challenges that we face, and we continue to have these dialogues. And so what I'd like to do is invite you to continue this dialogue using the Home is Where It All Starts campaign materials. Hopefully the slide will come up and you'll be able to see the URL. And this is a partnership. This public education campaign was developed by Home Matters to Arizona and MAG, and in collaboration with a number of partners. And it's based on extensive research and community engagement. The goal of the campaign is to reshape the narrative around affordable housing. And as we've talked about, there's a lot of sort of negative connotation when it comes to the words affordable housing. And so being able to kind of flip the dialogue and talk about affordable rents and mortgages, homes within reach, homes that meet our needs. I would like to just do a small plug. As you know, I'm the research director for Morrison Institute, and I am the new co-director for our new center. We are developing a center with Druckmann Institute at U of A, and it's the newly formed Arizona Research Center for Housing Equity and Sustainability. And we will be collaborating with Home Matters to Arizona and MAG to evaluate the impact of this campaign and attitudes toward housing affordability. So you can stay tuned for that. And then in closing, I would like to thank you all for your time here today. And I want to thank our panelists for joining us and having this really great conversation. A special thanks for MAG and supporting us to get all of this to happen, and my awesome co-host Deb Sydenham, of course. We will follow up with an email with resource links as well as an evaluation survey. And I wish you all a great afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.